In the golden age of Hollywood, when dreams were manufactured on studio lots and magic was created with nothing more than smoke, mirrors, and sheer determination, one film promised to transport audiences to a world of wonder beyond the rainbow. But behind the Technicolor facade of what would become cinema's most beloved fairy tale lay a nightmare of toxic materials, child abuse, and systematic cruelty that would make the Wicked Witch herself seem merciful by comparison. This is not the story you think you know. This is not the tale of a young girl's innocent journey through a magical land. This is the wicked true story of The Wizard of Oz, a production so cursed, so plagued by disaster and human suffering, that many who lived through it would later wonder if they had stumbled into their own twisted version of hell, disguised as the Land of Oz. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about this classic film. The real story involves a 16-year-old girl systematically destroyed by a machine that valued profit over human life. It reveals a studio system so callous that it routinely poisoned its own actors with deadly chemicals while demanding they smile for the cameras, and it exposes a production where serious injuries, toxic exposure, and psychological torture were not unfortunate accidents, but accepted costs of doing business in the dream factory. By the time you reach the end of this journey, you will never be able to watch Dorothy skip down that yellow brick road the same way again. Because the true horror of The Wizard of Oz was not the flying monkeys or the melting witch. It was what happened when the cameras stopped rolling. The year was 1938, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was desperate. Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had just proven that audiences would flock to see a full-length fairy tale brought to life on the big screen. The studio executives, hungry for their own piece of this lucrative pie, decided to adapt L. Frank Baum's beloved children's novel into what they hoped would be their own magical masterpiece. They allocated a staggering $3 million to the project, equivalent to $55 million today, making it one of the most expensive productions of its era. But from the very first day of filming, it became clear that something was fundamentally wrong with this production. The studio had assembled what should have been a dream team of Hollywood talent, yet the set quickly devolved into a carnival of misery that would leave permanent scars on nearly everyone involved. The first victim of this cursed production was a young girl named Frances Gumm, though the world would come to know her by her stage name, Judy Garland. At just 16 years old, she was already showing signs of the depression and eating disorders that would plague her for the rest of her tragically short life. But rather than providing support for this vulnerable child, the studio system would exploit every weakness, pushing her to the absolute breaking point in service of their magical vision. The executives took one look at the teenage Garland and decided she was not suitable for their vision of Dorothy. They wanted someone who looked like Shirley Temple, not a young woman beginning to develop an adult figure. So they put her on a diet that would be considered criminal child abuse by today's standards. She was forced to eat nothing but cottage cheese, chicken soup, and black coffee, while wearing a painfully tight corset designed to hide any signs of her natural development. The psychological abuse was even more devastating. Studio executives routinely called her the fat little pig with pigtails behind her back, a cruel nickname that would echo in her mind for years to come. When the demanding shooting schedule left her exhausted rather than allowing adequate rest, the studio supplied her with amphetamines to keep her energy up during the day and sleeping pills to help her crash at night. This deadly cycle of uppers and downers would hook the 16-year-old on prescription drugs, setting her on a path of addiction that would ultimately contribute to her death at age 47. The cruelty extended to the set itself, where director Victor Fleming showed no patience for a traumatized teenager struggling under impossible conditions. When Garland had difficulty crying on cue during an emotional scene, Fleming simply slapped her across the face, believing that physical violence was an acceptable directing technique. The emotional abuse was constant, with Fleming frequently insulting the young actress and subjecting her to verbal attacks designed to break down her confidence. Meanwhile, the pay disparity told its own story about how little the studio valued their young star. While her male co-stars Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, Burt Lahr and Frank Morgan each earned approximately $3,000 per week, Garland received just $500. She was the heart and soul of the entire production, yet she was paid a fraction of what her supporting cast members received. But Garland was not the only victim of the studio's callous disregard for human safety. The entire production was built upon a foundation of toxic materials and dangerous practices that would be considered criminal by today's standards. The most shocking example of this was the liberal use of asbestos throughout the film, despite the fact that the health risks of this deadly mineral were already well known in the 1930s. In one of the film's most beautiful and memorable sequences, Dorothy and her companions fall asleep in a field of poppies, only to be awakened by what appears to be gently falling snow. That pristine white substance covering Judy Garland and her co-stars was not snow at all. It was pure chrysotile asbestos, one of the most dangerous forms of this cancer-causing material. The filmmakers chose asbestos because it was fireproof and resembled real snow closely enough to fool audiences, but they were essentially covering their actors in a substance that could cause lung inflammation, scarring, genetic damage, and a rare form of cancer called mesothelioma. The asbestos contamination extended far beyond that single scene. The Wicked Witch's broomstick was constructed from asbestos fibres, and Ray Bolger's entire scarecrow costume was stuffed with the deadly material. Every day that Bolger wore that costume, he risked inhaling microscopic fibres that could become permanently trapped in his lungs, ticking time bombs that could detonate years or even decades later in the form of deadly diseases. This was not ignorance on the part of the studio. By the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s, artificial snow made from asbestos was being sold under dozens of commercial brand names like White Magic, Pure White, and Snowdrift. The marketing materials openly advertised the product's asbestos content, meaning that everyone involved in the production knew exactly what they were exposing their actors to. They simply did not care. The costume department seemed determined to torture the actors in new and creative ways. Bert Lahr's cowardly lion outfit was constructed from an actual lion hide and weighed nearly 90 pounds. The costume provided virtually no ventilation, causing Lahr to sweat profusely during filming in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit due to the intense lighting required for Technicolor photography. The costume became so saturated with perspiration that it required 2 assistants to dry it out completely every single night. Jack Haley, who played the Tin Man, faced his own unique torment. His metal costume was so rigid that he could not sit down while wearing it. When he needed to rest between takes, assistants would prop him against a wooden board, leaving him to stand in the sweltering heat like a piece of furniture. But Haley was not even the first actor cast in the role. He was a replacement for Buddy Ebsen, whose experience with the Tin Man makeup nearly cost him his life. Buddy Ebsen's story represents one of the most chilling examples of how the studio system treated human beings as expendable resources in pursuit of their artistic vision. Originally cast as the Tin Man, Ebsen underwent a daily ritual that was slowly killing him from the inside out. Every morning, makeup artists would coat his face and exposed skin with a fine aluminum powder, creating the metallic sheen that the character required. What nobody realized, or perhaps what nobody cared to investigate, was that Ebsen was inhaling microscopic particles of this metal with every breath he took. Day after day, as the aluminum accumulated in his lungs, Ebsen began to experience severe respiratory distress. His breathing became laboured, his skin took on an unnatural blue tint, and his entire system began to shut down as his body fought against the foreign material invading his organs. When he finally collapsed and was rushed to the hospital, doctors discovered that he was suffering from aluminum poisoning so severe that he required treatment in an oxygen tent just to survive. The studio's response to this near-fatal incident was not to investigate their safety practices or to provide better protection for their actors. Instead, they simply recast the role with Jack Haley and switched from aluminum powder to aluminum paste, believing this would solve the problem. It did not. Haley immediately developed a painful eye infection from the new makeup formulation, but he was expected to continue working despite his discomfort. The message was clear. The show must go on, regardless of the human cost. But perhaps no single incident embodies the callous disregard for safety more than the fire that nearly killed Margaret Hamilton during the filming of the Wicked Witch's dramatic exit from Munchkinland. The scene required Hamilton to deliver her famous line, "I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too," before disappearing in a cloud of smoke and roaring flames through a trap door in the stage floor. Director Victor Fleming was a perfectionist who demanded multiple takes of every scene, and this particular sequence had already proven problematic. The timing had to be absolutely precise. Hamilton needed to deliver her line, complete her dramatic spin, and disappear below the stage before the pyrotechnics ignited. But after breaking for lunch on December 23, 1938, Fleming decided he wanted one more take for safety, ironically enough. The crew had attempted the scene 4 times already, but technical difficulties kept interfering with the shot. Fleming's patience was wearing thin, and witnesses later recalled him telling Hamilton, "I want this shot done right and done right now." The pressure to perform was immense, and Hamilton, despite her growing unease about the dangerous stunt, agreed to attempt the scene one more time. What happened next would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The pyrotechnics ignited before Hamilton had safely descended through the trapdoor, engulfing her in a wall of flame. The actress suffered second-degree burns across her face and third-degree burns on her right hand as she desperately tried to shield herself from the inferno. But her agony was only beginning. The green makeup that transformed Hamilton into the Wicked Witch was made from copper-based paint, which was not only highly toxic but also extremely flammable. As the flames licked at her face, the makeup began to burn, creating additional chemical burns on top of the thermal injuries she had already sustained. When emergency responders finally reached her, they had to scrub her raw, burned flesh with acetone to remove the toxic paint, a process that Hamilton later described as more painful than the fire itself. Years afterward, Hamilton would reflect on that moment with a mixture of trauma and disbelief. "I'll never, as long as I live, have anything that takes my breath away like that pain," she remembered. The actress was hospitalized for 6 weeks and refused to have anything further to do with fire effects for the remainder of the production. The studio's response to this horrific accident was not to improve safety protocols or to provide additional protection for their performers. Instead, they hired a stunt double named Betty Danko to handle the remaining dangerous sequences involving the Wicked Witch character. But even this supposedly safer arrangement would prove disastrous. On February 11, 1939, Danko was performing the skywriting sequence where the witch writes "Surrender Dorothy" in the sky above the Emerald City. The effect required her to sit astride what appeared to be the witch's broomstick, but was actually a smoking pipe designed to create the illusion of flight. On the 3rd take of the scene, the pipe exploded beneath her, sending Danko to the hospital with severe burns on both legs that would leave her permanently scarred. 2 women, 2 explosions, 2 trips to the hospital, and still the production continued without any meaningful changes to their safety procedures. The pattern was clear. Human beings were considered replaceable, but the schedule was sacred. The toxic culture extended beyond the physical dangers to encompass the atmosphere of psychological abuse and harassment that permeated every aspect of the production. The actors hired to play the Munchkins found themselves at the center of a controversy that reveals the darker aspects of Hollywood's treatment of performers who did not fit the traditional mold. Many of these actors were little people who had travelled from across the country for what they hoped would be a career-making opportunity. Instead, they found themselves housed in a single hotel and subjected to a level of scrutiny and judgment that bordered on dehumanizing. Stories began to circulate about wild parties and inappropriate behaviour, tales that painted the Munchkin actors as uncontrollable and unprofessional. Judy Garland herself would later contribute to these narratives, describing the Munchkin actors as little drunks who got smashed every night and had to be picked up in butterfly nets. But these stories, repeated for decades as amusing Hollywood folklore, mask a more disturbing reality about the power dynamics at play on the set. According to Judy Garland's husband Sid Luft, writing in his memoir years later, the teenage actress faced harassment from multiple sources during the production. He alleged that some of the Munchkin actors would put their hands under Garland's dress, believing they could get away with inappropriate behaviour because of their size. These were not teenagers engaging in harmless pranks, but grown men in their 40s who saw a vulnerable young girl and decided to exploit her powerlessness within the studio system. The truth about these allegations remains murky, with some participants vehemently denying the claims, while others suggest the stories may have been a way for Garland to deflect attention from even more serious abuse she was suffering at the hands of studio executives and other powerful figures in the production. What is certain is that a 16-year-old girl was placed in an environment where she felt unsafe and unsupported, surrounded by adults who saw her not as a person deserving protection, but as a commodity to be exploited for profit. This atmosphere of abuse and negligence was not confined to a single incident or a single victim. It was systemic, woven into the very fabric of how the production operated. When Buddy Ebsen nearly died from aluminum poisoning, the studio's solution was to find a replacement and continue filming. When Margaret Hamilton was severely burned in a pyrotechnics accident, they hired a stunt double and kept the cameras rolling. When that stunt double was also injured in an explosion, they simply found ways to complete the remaining scenes without addressing the underlying safety issues. The systematic nature of these failures reveals something far more sinister than mere negligence. This was a machine designed to consume human lives in service of entertainment, a system where the suffering of individuals was not just accepted, but factored into the cost of doing business. The studio executives who made these decisions were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were businessmen operating within a framework that valued artistic achievement and financial success above all other considerations, including basic human dignity. The irony was not lost on those who lived through the production. Here was a film about a young girl's journey to find her way home, a story about the power of friendship and the importance of believing in yourself, being created through methods that embodied the exact opposite of those values. Dorothy's famous declaration that "there's no place like home" rang hollow when the actress speaking those words had been systematically cut off from any sense of safety or belonging by the very people responsible for bringing her character to life. The original source material by L. Frank Baum contained its own dark undercurrents that the film adaptation attempted to sanitize, yet somehow the production process managed to inject even more disturbing elements than the author had ever imagined. Baum's original story featured the Tin Man decapitating wolves with an axe and various characters meeting violent ends, but these fictional brutalities pale in comparison to the real-world cruelties inflicted on the human beings who brought his fantasy to life. The temperature on set regularly soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit due to the massive lighting arrays required for Technicolor filming, creating an environment where heat exhaustion and carbon dioxide poisoning became constant threats. Actors collapsed regularly from the combination of heavy costumes, toxic makeup, and oppressive heat, yet the production schedule demanded that filming continue regardless of these medical emergencies. Perhaps most telling was the studio's handling of the film's multiple director changes. By the time filming concluded, The Wizard of Oz had cycled through 4 different directors, each bringing their own vision and methods to a production that was already spinning out of control. These constant changes in leadership meant that safety protocols, when they existed at all, were never consistently implemented or enforced, and so, when the final scene was shot and the last piece of asbestos swept from the soundstage, what remained was a masterpiece built on a foundation of human suffering. The Wizard of Oz would go on to become one of the most beloved films in cinema history, enchanting generations of viewers who had no idea of the true cost of their entertainment. The film's enduring popularity stands as a monument to both Hollywood's creative genius and its moral bankruptcy. Every time we hear Over the Rainbow, we are listening to the voice of a 16-year-old girl who was systematically destroyed by the very people who made her famous. Every time we marvel at the elaborate costumes and makeup, we are admiring the work of artisans who knowingly poisoned their performers with deadly chemicals. The victims of this production carried their scars for the rest of their lives. Judy Garland's battle with addiction, which began on the set of The Wizard of Oz, would ultimately claim her life at just 47 years old. The actors who inhaled asbestos fibres faced decades of uncertainty about when those microscopic time bombs might detonate in their lungs. The women who were burned by pyrotechnics bore permanent physical reminders of Hollywood's callous disregard for human safety. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire story is how little has truly changed. The entertainment industry continues to prioritize profit over people, continues to exploit vulnerable performers, and continues to hide its darkest secrets behind walls of glamour and publicity. The faces and names may be different, but the fundamental machinery of exploitation remains largely intact. The next time you watch Dorothy click her ruby slippers together and declare that there's no place like home, remember that for the people who created that magic, the movie set was the furthest thing from home imaginable. It was a place where dreams were manufactured at the cost of human souls, where the yellow brick road was paved with the suffering of those too powerless to say no. The real Wizard of Oz was never the man behind the curtain in the Emerald City. It was the studio system itself, a monstrous machine that promised to grant wishes while systematically destroying the lives of those who dared to believe in the magic of Hollywood.